Hey everyone, so I am Randy and I am very excited to do this episode. And I am so glad that I finally brought my friend Ed. Ed Do, welcome to the show. And I want to say a couple of things about Ed. Ed currently works in Capitol Hill. He works for a U.S. congressman in Texas and doing communication and doing communications leadership work. And Ed is a 1.5 mixed Korean American. You were raised in Seoul, Korea, and you moved to the States when you were 10 years old. And what's very interesting about Ed is that your mom's side of the family, your Korean side of the family, was involved in politics, especially during the time of going back to the Japanese colonization of Korea from the early 20th century to the uh, the South Korean dictatorship that was happening during the 70s and 80s, and how this has actually informed your own politics. And um, Ed has also worked for Senator Elizabeth Warren, and you then came to Chicago. You were working on building out NGOs, and doing it in a very much in the philosophy of decolonizing what a typical NGO should look like. And you also wrote in your bio, unfortunately, you had to return to DC, which I'm sure you'll have plenty to say. Working in for a congressman in Texas, and and also like you also put down you're an avowed pragmatic progressive. He has been described as the most blunt and acerbic human being on earth. You're kind of up there, from what I have experienced in the last few years. Um, and you're into Taekwondo, you compete internationally, and you're also gay as fuck, which, hello, that's awesome. And Ed is someone that I've known for the past 2 years. Actually, I think it was through Jonathan Gibbs. Shout out to him. I think it was like when I saw his posting about your encounter with U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, which we will talk more about. But yeah, I've been very excited to have Ed on. And Ed, welcome to the show. How are you doing? How are you navigating 2025 with maybe a mere 3 months left?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thanks for having me, Randy. Special shout out to Jonathan Gibbs, right? I feel like he connects everyone sort of in this like Asian American and like sort of intersectional justice and advocacy space and political space together. And he's just, a 10 out of 10 human being. If you don't know, he's also founded Black Asian Alliance Network. He's done a lot of anti-racism work within the Asian and the Black communities, a lot of sort of intersectional work. Great person, also gay, right? And also multiracial. Um, and shout out to you too, Randy. I remember when I first met you and you had sort of sunsetted your podcast initially, saying that you were done with it. And then I remember, I think it was like the second or third thing I said to you, saying, "We'll see how long that lasts," right? And now we're back. To answer your question, I have been navigating day by day. I think as a lot of your listeners probably have as well, right? There's no one way I've been navigating it. Some days are healthier than others, right? Some days I'm just sort of malaise in bed if I have that privilege, right?
Mhm.
To do nothing. And other days I'm hopped up on, 12 shots of espresso, bouncing off the wall, doing what I can. And then, still other days, if I'm in Taekwondo, I'm sparring some an opponent that I don't particularly like. Um, I'll take my aggression out on them and hopefully have good health insurance for the ambulance ride.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and also thank you for doing the hard work, which I really want to um dig into the weeds with. And so going back to the beginning, growing up with in a multiracial family in Korea, and with your mom's side of the family being involved with Korean politics, how did they get involved into the Korean pro-Korean democracy work, and what was that environment like for them during that time, for your grandma and then for your mom, which are two very different experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So my family, They're sort of very typical in a lot of ways of many Korean families of that generation, and then other ways they are your atypical Korean family. So let me explain. My grandmother was born in 1928 in the middle of Japanese occupation, right? 9 years after the very large Korean independence movement in 1919 was crushed by the Imperial Japanese authorities that had occupied Korea at the time, and 18 years after the official colonization of Korea, into the incorporation of the empire, right, of Japan. My grandmother was not actually born with a Korean name, right? It was illegal at that time to have your first name as a Korean name, right? So all of the things that she learned initially were actually Japanese, right? Her birth certificate was signed in Japanese, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, um, she was really fortunate insofar as that my great grandfather, my great grandmother, were still very radically pro-Korean. They had been involved in sort of the modernization efforts of Korea, right? They had, you know, been part of this class of uh, educated, intellectualized, sort of Korean academics, right? That sort of found that they need to modernize the society and the systems within Korea while also trying to maintain it because they found it to be the only way to maintain independence long run. So that goal was not initially successful for multiple reasons in Korea due to the competition of colonial powers around Korea. But they still instilled that idea of a free and independent Korea into my grandmother, right? So growing up at home, they would do things like instill her with Korean values, Korean culture, language. They would attend meetings where she would learn traditional Korean dance, right? There's a traditional sort of martial arts dance form in Korean called Taekyon. She learned about that quite extensively, right? That eventually contributed to Taekwondo that was founded in the 1950s and 60s in Korea. And so it was all these small little things that really matriculated and turned, my grandmother into someone with, a strong foundation in her cultural roots. I think what also helped was, my grandmother was at the prime age, right, during World War II, where the Japanese Imperial Army was starting to recruit Korean women to become sex slaves on the war fronts, right? These comfort women. My grandmother, was 15 in 1943, right? At the peak of sort of like comfort women sex slavery, right? 16, right? And she saw a lot of her friends just disappear. They were recruited from poorer backgrounds, from middle income, even, lower middle income backgrounds, occasionally, sometimes from the upper class, and they would just disappear and they would never be seen again, right? They would be killed as sex slaves on the war front. My grandmother's parents and her were very mindful and to make sure that they would never send their daughter into something like that, right? I remember my grandmother saying that her parents said we would rather have our family starve than you become a slave to the Imperial Army. And that's exactly what happened. My grandmother married relatively late. She had children in her mid 20s, which in 1940s and 1950s Korea was unheard of, right? She married in her early 20s, which was, 5, 6 years after the average age at the time. And it wasn't an arranged marriage, right? She got to sort of pick her husband based on love, right? Which was also very rare. And, during the war itself, my grandmother, her mom, and her father, right? Uh, when it was still colonized by Japan, actually ran a lot of resistance movements. So specifically, they themselves were not necessarily soldiers in Korean resistance guerrilla armies, but what they did was that they would aid independence fighters and independence spies. So a really good example is my grandmother and her family had a small house in Seoul, and they ran an inn out of it. And a lot of Korean folks in the independence network would stay at that inn or stay at their house. And there would occasionally be Japanese soldiers and imperial officers as well. But in order to signal if that there was danger or not, or if that they were in a dangerous situation or not, my grandmother and her mom and her dad would swap out the soups. And this sounds innocuous, right? But if you were a Korean independence fighter or a spy and you were fleeing from a Japanese sort of, officer or army official and you came to her inn, she would give you a clear bone soup like sarangtang, right? Which was mild in flavor that said, you're in the clear, you're good, like you can chill. But if you were in danger, she would spice the soup up, like turn into like snoop or something, right? Like something spicy and hot to signal that they need to lay low or get the hell out. And if you were a Japanese sort of army officer and you weren't used to like Korean food, or if you looked down on Korean food, right, you wouldn't know, what the signs of a spicy soup versus a clear bone broth like mild soup, right? Those like through these like small acts of resistance, within their own like sort of like class and like what they knew how to do, that they were able to preserve their patriotism for their country and culture and independence movement. And that, you know, slowly turned into my mom and her sisters and my uncle sort of like becoming involved. My grandmother had my eldest aunt, who's the oldest child of four, right? In the middle of the Korean War. It was actually the sixth battle of Seoul, right? She had my eldest aunt. Abortion was not widely available, obviously, so it unfortunately ended up happening, right? My grandmother then had three other children. My mom is the youngest. Her husband died when my mom was 4 years old, right?
Mm.
And she went to work in the factories, back-breaking labor, and did whatever she had to do to raise her family. My grandmother, though, was really progressive, right? Like for her age. She never, made her daughters marry off into richer families early, right? And she sort of encouraged, and she made them finish school, right? Up until high school. And then she saved enough money to send one of the four kids to college. Um, and traditionally in Korea, right, it doesn't matter if you're a shitty ass man or not, right? You send your son to college or you give the money to your son. That's not what my grandmother did, right? My grandmother sort of looked at my uncle and said, you're a lazy piece of shit. You don't deserve this. And she gave that to my eldest aunt, who went to college and got a degree where in a time where less than 2% of Korean women were going to undergrad, right? And the daughters worked hard and they sort of, they support the family and made a name for themselves. My aunt, started working for the foreign ministry many years down the line. First, she was a teacher, then a principal, right? My mom opened up her own restaurant, and my other aunt ended up opening up her own clothing business, right? And then who knows about the uncle? We don't talk to him. But I think what's really important here too is in the 1970s and 80s, there was a slew of US supported dictators in South Korea who are quite brutal in their oppression of human rights, right? And my mom at the time had taken a job outside of Seoul in a southern province called Jeolla in Korea, which is still to this day a relatively progressive and liberal province in South Korea. This province had a very famous uprising called the Gwangju Uprising, in which the residents of the city decided to protest the Korean dictator at the time, Chung Do-an. Um, you know, Up to 4,000 people lost their lives in this protest. The city was put under martial law, and it's considered one of the bloodiest, independence demonstrations in East Asia up until Tiananmen Square. My mom lost friends in that. She was part of the protest because she happened to be in the province. She wasn't, by the way, she had attended protests before, but she had never planned on attending what became essentially an uprising against the dictatorship at this time. And my mom was put on a wanted list for years by the South Korean government. So she taught herself English, right? And she comes from a very poor family, right? A single mom. She taught herself English, and she took a job in Hong Kong, becoming a Western goods importer for South Korea. And then once South Korea transitioned to democracy, and she was charges against her were dropped, she returned in 1994, which is when I was also born in Korea. My mom, was 35 when she had me and unmarried, right? And she was 41 when she had my younger sister. And she was, ended up being single at that, shortly after my sister's birth as well. So there is sort of this unbroken line in my family where the women in my family sort of defy cultural expectations, defy the society that they're born in, and they're the ones who are responsible for our decolonization movements and our progressivism and like sort of like pushing people into politics and being the best versions of themselves. They're not perfect, right? They still carry a lot of generational trauma. But this is why I say that my family is really atypical in Korea for a lot of reasons, because it's matrilineal and matriarchal in many ways, right? Uh, and especially in a time, in a context where that wasn't the norm or the case. And it really was my grandmother and my mother who instilled this sense of you need to fight for yourself, for your family, and for other people's rights. Because if it's not us, it's not, no one's going to do it. I think what's also really interesting about this is like my grandmother didn't really talk about this, right? My mother didn't really talk about this. I found this all out after my grandmother passed away in 2006, right? I went to Korea without my mom knowing, by myself for the first time since I had left. And I had sat down with my family, and they sort of gave me her journals, her pictures, her documents. I met friends of hers who had fought with her in the Korean independence movement. I, talked to long lost relatives, right? And they're the ones who sort of painted this picture. And after I came back to the States and I told my mom about it, she also told me her own like involvement with, anti-dictatorship protests, and why she got involved and how she fled Korea and came back, et cetera, et cetera. So my involvement in politics and policy and decolonization is directly rooted in the really strong women in my family, right? My family would not be here if it was not for the women in my family. And my political beliefs would not be as strong as they are if it weren't for people like my grandmother in the independence movement or my mother protesting Korean dictatorships.
Hmm. I gotta say, many many kudos to your mom, your grandma, and really the women in your family that have modeled uh, a lot of the courage to, navigate and to fight against and support the liberation of the Korean people, from either from the Japanese to America um, to what was happening during South Korea during the very turbulent 70s and 80s era. And so when you look back in that history, because I think it's very interesting how you had to find out about your grandma's work. And I feel like it's very common for folks whose parents and grandparents that have been affected by war and been directly active during those times to not talk about that. How do you think that actually affected her and the relationship with your mom and also with you before she had passed? Like, because I feel like when secrets are kept inside and, God knows how much trauma both of your grandma and your mom experienced, like, how did that affect your relationship with them? And how did it really affect you as a person growing
Yeah,
up?
absolutely. I think like, colonization is really interesting, right? Because you can defeat it in, certain forms, right? But it still carries over in other forms like
Mhm.
trauma and, especially when you immigrate to a new country. So my grandmother and my mother, they were close, right? But they were close insofar as like sort of the Korean family values of close, right? I'd never seen them sort of tell each other that, we love each other, like, all those like stereotypes that we have, like Asian families, like not being able to verbalize those things. But like my grandmother and my mom like barely saw each other for 14 plus years of my mom's life. My grandmother was in the factories after her husband died, making a living. My mom likes to tell the story of one time she was walking, to school, and she stepped on some sort of industrial, uh, waist, I believe, right? And it was metallic, right? It pierced her foot. And, she wasn't too far away from her house, but no one was in her house. Like her siblings had gone to school and her mom was in the factory and she couldn't leave. So a kind neighbor took her to the hospital, right? But my mom tells this story because she tells it of like, like I like I understand why your grandmother wasn't there, but your grandmother wasn't there. Which, and my grandmother knew that, right? Like, which is why when, my grandmother was able to retire, all she did was dote on her grandchildren, right? Like, there's not a moment I don't remember in which my grandmother was not present in the first, 10, 12 years of my life,
Mhm.
right? She was there at every major event. She was at every birthday. I only have positive memories of my grandma. My mom, not so much. There are gaps there for my mom, right? And don't get me wrong, my mom is modeled off my grandmother in many ways. She's strong. She's, very politically informed for her context. She is a strong democratic activist, right? But she still holds these traumas that, my grandmother was unfortunately not able to fill. And that passes on to me, right? Like I am close with my mom, but my mom is still someone that she's the only person in the world that can make me go from 0 to 100 on the anger scale, right? Like instantly. And part of that is like we have invested so much energy into creating better outcomes and futures that we often miss the people around us in the present, right? Because our idea about this is almost, I can't be here for you in the present, but you'll understand why I'm doing what I'm doing when you live in a better future, right? And obviously, as a kid, my mom didn't understand that from my grandma. But my mom and I had this discussion where she said, I remember packing my bags and fleeing South Korea and going to Hong Kong for the first time. And she said on the plane, she started crying, not because she was leaving Korea, like that sucked, right? But she said because I had realized that like the reason why like your grandmother was absent so much in my childhood is because she was fighting for a better Korea for me. And now she's fleeing to Hong Kong, right? Like there was a continuation of my grandmother's mission at that point. Um, Same thing with me in the States, right? Like they're like my mom's not perfect, but like now that I am 31, there are a lot of moments where I look back, I'm like, yeah, like my mom was fighting for a better future for me. And that's why there are these holes, right? But that's also how this informs some of our political views, right? We're fighting so that these holes aren't the norm for people in the future, right? We're fighting for like if I was born 2 generations after, right? Like if there's another Edward, but if I'm reincarnated 2 generations down to my family line, right? I don't carry this trauma anymore because we've been able to change the system enough that this trauma is no longer something that is actively at the forefront or like in our frontal lobe, like affecting our everyday decisions, right? So, it affects us. Don't get me wrong, and I think that's also why our my mom and my grandmother didn't want to talk about it either, right? Like they saw, my grandmother saw millions die. She lived through World War II. She lived through colonial occupation. She lived through the Korean War, right? She saw her husband die from a lack of access to medical care, um, in a country that was preaching that the communists are evil, right? Her husband dies in a capitalistic country because Korea at the time just was poor under U.S. occupation and didn't provide universal health care. Of course, my grandmother, in many ways, and then she saw the rise of dictators when she was in her 40s and 50s, right? My grandmother, in many ways, probably thought at the time, what the hell did I sacrifice my youth for if this is going to be the outcome? I think that was the same with my mom, right? Like she was just like, what the hell did I sacrifice my youth for if, I have dictators, my friends are getting shot in the streets, if you know, the reason why my mom immigrated to the States with me is because I don't remember this, right? But apparently I came home one day from school and she was just sort of like, how was in Korea? And she was like, how was your day at school? And I go, oh, I really wish the teachers would stop locking me in the other room and giving me expired food for lunch. And she went to the school after she heard this, and it turned out that the teachers were like, we don't want race mixing, right? Um, between and like the kids thinking this is okay, and like they were also like he doesn't have a dad, right? Like this is not the right family values you want to do. So my mom probably also thought like, why the fuck did I, spend years in exile in Hong Kong only for my son, right, to grow up in a society that's still treating him like shit. Of course, like my mom probably didn't want to talk about all of that and all of her sacrifices, right? Or sort of that part of her life because it felt like her fight was sort of negated. Everything she had done just didn't amount to what she thought would be happening at that point. So I think there's this like weird, as much as like there's a liberationist streak in my family, right? There's this weird tension in my family between all of us that our work is not done, right? Our work continues. And there's almost a regret in that as well, right? Where my grandmother's just sort of like, I wish I had left behind a world where my daughter felt like she didn't need to fight anymore. My mom is the same way. I wish I left behind a world that Edward and my sister Jenny didn't need to fight or do what they do anymore, right? My mother recently retired to Korea. I brought her to the airport, and there were tears shed. And my mom sort of looked at me and she said, like, I'm sorry, like I am leaving y'all behind in a worse world than I would have liked to.
Mhm.
And that was sort of when I started connecting the dots too. Like, why am I doing what I do? Why did she do what she did? Why did my grandmother do what she did?
Mhm.
Right. So there is this tension and it does affect our relationships. But it's also what's driving us in some way, not always, but in some ways of our work is not finished for the next generation.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing the generational cycle that from your grandma to your mom and to you. And when you decided to get involved in politics, I presume like, you know, at a young age, what did you learn first about stepping into that landscape? Because I think anybody who goes into activism, politics for the first time, it's people are green-eyed um just being very green to this work and thinking optimism and yeah, we could change the world, we can, you know, erase a lot of the horrible things that America has done. But what did you learn about stepping into the American politics that actually realized like, wow, this is actually not as easy as I thought, and this looks very, very daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start with some context. Like my mother got involved with the Evangelical Korean Church, right, which is a product of the American and Scottish churches, right, who preach like white prosperity gospel in Korea, and it translated into a very conservative upbringing comparatively, right, to a lot of my peers. And that informed my political views up until about high school when I was identified as very solidly Republican conservative before I sort of like snapped out of it for various reasons, right? Thank God I had the people around me, the mentors I had around me, and I was just like, oh, conservatism's bullshit. Also, I'm gay. And I'm not white by US Census definitions, right? There's a lot of layers here. But when I was first entering politics, it was after that initial transition from sort of conservative to progressive, such, American liberal, whatever you want to call it, had happened. And that was exactly what I had imagined for myself. Even as a little kid, I sort of like looked at the US Capitol. I'm like, wow, like beacon of democracy, like this is gonna be awesome. We're gonna change the world. They just need, more people like me. I still think part of that's true. We do need more people like me. We need more people like you. We need more, you know, people like the people in my office, right? But I think what's changed is there's no longer this sense of optimism, right? That you can talk to maybe your conservative neighbor, and as long as like they like you and they accept you, that you can convince them, right, of the greatness that America can be when it embraces, people who don't look like each other, people of different sexualities, et cetera, right? That naivety in me is gone, right? I think that is long gone. That's been gone since, probably about 2012 when I saw the signs of Donald Trump sort of like forming the cracks, the writing on the wall. I think there's also, you know, I think a lot of people will go on sort of podcasts like yours, right, who work in politics, and they're like, doom and gloom, we hate everything, everyone sucks. I've met a lot of awful, really awful people, right? Both on the Democratic and Republican side. I have also met, frankly, especially now that I'm a senior staffer on the Democratic side, some of the most wonderful people in the world. Like people who truly are doing this job because they give a shit, because they want you to have a better life. They want everyone to have a better life. They want America to be a more accepting place, a more embracing place, the more I sort of like patchwork of folks, right? And that includes a lot of elected officials, right? Like
Mhm.
there are like I think there's this like this idea that like a lot of Democratic Congress folks are out of touch, right? They're not, right? Like some of them are, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them aren't. They truly give a shit. Like I have seen Democratic congressmen and women like crying over like really awful policies or people in detention, right? And fight as hard as they can on the background, right? Like those are the moments that I think that like as much as like my naivety about some things have sort of like washed away, a lot of sort of hope or optimism about people that I work with or within the same political alignment as me have also restored a lot of faith in me, right? I don't think I would still be in this position under the current administration circumstances if those people were not present every single day of this fight.
Hmm. It's a very interesting point that you bring up because, to be a staffer for a congressperson, you are the eyes and ears of the constituents, but you're also the eyes and ears for the elected representatives. And it also makes me wonder because like I myself have been extremely disillusioned since the 2024 election. And I'm like, you know what? I really am sick and tired of the politics. I don't know what to say. I don't know what we can do at this point because, like a lot of us, especially progressives, are like fed up for the past 10 years, at least the last 10 years, where, where Trumpism has really taken over this country. And it's like, why are people still falling into this trap? But on the Democratic side, I also wonder what it must be like to be a staffer for U.S. Democrat Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, who has, you know, turned away from a lot of the Democratic um, messaging that his voters voted him for. So I wonder what that must be like for, I know you can't speak on Fetterman and the staff, but I'm also like thinking, gosh, I'm sure that there must be so many tense moments where you're like fighting with your elected rep and the staffers about policies, about the impact that it's going to have on the communities and so forth. But how do you like, navigate all of this messaging and trying to like work with the public and with the elected representatives?
I think that's a really interesting point, right? I'm not Fetterman staff, and the congressperson I work for is, someone that is really well informed about their constituents. They grew up in the area that they are representing, right? They reflect the demographics in a lot of ways of the area that they're representing, and they've, like literally, you'll walk down the street in the district that he represents, and they'll call him by his first name. That's how, because they've known him for 30 years, right? Or they knew him since he's been a kindergartner. I will say this. There's a lot of nuance in policy that is missed, right? Not just by the media, but when you get on Twitter fights. There's a lot of things I think people are like, why aren't Democrats fighting back as hard? That people don't understand that is happening in the background, right? So I remember there's all these tourist terms constantly about like, why aren't Democrats fighting this? Why aren't Democrats fighting that? And there are moments certainly that I think individual representatives and senators will agree, right? That they disagree with how the fight has happened. Then there are other moments that like they have fought as hard as they can from a legal perspective, right? They've done everything that they legally can, but it's such a weird, complicated policy mix that there's nothing else that they can actually do within the law, right? Really good example. When Republicans cut Medicaid by $1 trillion in July, we were up, 4 or 5 days straight without sleep. We were filibustering, we were delaying it in committee. We are trying to rewrite, add amendments, take out, block votes, right? At the end of the day, if you're not in the majority in Congress, especially in the House is just a simple majority vote, right?
Mhm.
Ultimately, you're on borrowed time. So we delayed it the longest any bill has ever been delayed in the House, right? Hakeem Jeffries, regardless of what you believe he will fight or not fight with, had, the longest magic minute that is like final speech. It was like from 4 a.m. until I think it was like 12 p.m., right? Longest speech in the House history to just delay the vote because Republicans were trying to vote on this at 3 a.m. And then you would wake up as the American public and this would have been buried in the dead of night. He was just sort of like, I'm going to speak on this 8 hours so that people are awake and they're paying attention when this
Mhm.
happens, right? You look at Gavin Newsom. He's redistricting California in response to Texas. Like, God bless him, right? People are fighting as hard as they can. Staffers are fighting as hard as they can. Most Democratic reps and senators I know are fighting as hard as they can within the law. There's only so much that they can do. And that's unfortunately the reality situation, right? Now, we are finding new and creative ways to fight. That redistricting gamble that Gavin Newsom and now Kathy Hochul and potentially Pritzker and Wes Moore are all discussing openly, and Phil Murphy, I believe, are discussing openly. Those are new and creative, powerful ways to fight. And that is what we are trying to do every day. On the end of the Congress member and the staff, there are always going to be disagreements, right? If you are a congressperson, your staff is anywhere in DC, right? Not just including the district
Mhm.
offices, of anywhere between the House side, like 12 to 20 people in DC. And then on the Senate side, it's much larger because they represent the entire state, right? You're going to have 12 to 20 different opinions on a policy issue or how to speak or what to say. Ultimately, what they're trying to do is represent their constituents as best as they can in most situations, right? With most Congress folks. And sometimes it doesn't make sense nationally, right? To the entire Democratic Party. Some votes won't make sense to, let's say, if I am an average resident in Dallas, right? And my entire job, and I'm speaking for our district, and my entire job as someone who didn't go to college relies on, let's say, a non-green industry, right? The vote that that representative takes on oil, right, matters in a different way than what a representative will from Massachusetts will do on offshore wind or offshore solar or solar energy, right? So what I will say this is this: where there is pushback, there's often shifts in views, right? I have seen a lot of Congress people who have changed their approach, their fight, their words, or even their policies because staff have pushed them in a certain direction. Vice versa too, where a congressperson comes in and goes, I know what you're trying to do. Here is the reality of our state or the people that we're representing. And this is why I'm taking the policy that I do. Most of that is covered in a way that's not public. I think in the case of John Fetterman, in the case of certain other folks, it becomes much more public because of the radical shifts of their campaign versus them in an elected office.
Hmm. I think that's a really important insight that you shared, especially with the context that a lot of people are not aware about what goes on behind the scenes, especially from the Democratic Party. And it's also been, very clear that a lot of progressive voters have been very disillusioned
Yep.
since the election because of what's going on in Gaza, what
Yep.
has um, what has been where like APAC has, influenced a lot of the politicians, definitely on the Republican side, but also on the Democratic side. And also like on immigration, on the deportation issues. And there's like a plethora of of issues that it seems very hard for progressives to agree on, versus like where the right wing conservatives tend to have this one thing in common and they stay with it, they unify through it. And I think that is also something to like really name and why we are in this current environment. I also think like about your district in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And that is a demographic that has been changing since definitely since the Obama
Yep.
administration. And that has been kind of going from red to purple to I would say lean blue. Correct me if I'm wrong. And especially with what's going on with Texas with the gerrymandering that the GOP is trying to redraw, which for a lot of folks that don't know, and I what I could say about the gerrymandering is that whoever gets the majority in the state level, whether it's the Republicans or Democrats, and on a specific, I think on a census year, they can redraw the map to favor a
Yep.
party. And so in this case, um, this current gerrymandering map um, has really suppressed a lot of Black and Latinx and Asian voters in a lot of the heavily populated cities, like including Dallas and Fort Worth, Houston, Austin. Um, I'm very curious about both the district makeup and what their views are, and how does it align with where the Democratic Party stands nationally, and um, also with the current gerrymandering and what will be the consequence when, if and when this goes through, which more is likely a when. But yeah,
Yep.
I'm very curious to know what that dynamic also looks like.
Yeah, let me put it this way too, right?
Mhm.
So every state does their redistricting on a slightly different way. The state legislature decides districts generally. Some states allow for blatant partisan gerrymandering in their constitution. That includes Texas, right? If a Texas government says, I want more Republican seats, gerrymander, they are legally able to do that. Other states, like Wisconsin and California, have independent redistricting commissions that don't allow that. And normally it's every 10 years. However, the reason why Texas is so interesting is because they're doing it not on a census year. We don't have new demographic data, right? Since the last census. It's been 4 to 5 years since that's happened. They are doing this purely for seats. However, the trends of Texas have been, generally speaking, almost 100% of the growth from Texas, almost, right, has been from Black, Asian, and Latino voters, right? In DFW, in Tarrant County, where Fort Worth is, it's about 100% of that growth, right? Dallas is solidly blue. Fort Worth leans blue. Tarrant County is literally 50-50. It's very purple. Texas as a whole is also now majority minority, meaning that Black, Asian, and Latinx voters and pop demographics make up the majority of the state. So when we talk about Texas, I want to be clear. It is not a red state. It is not a white state. The reason why it is white and red is because of voter suppression, right? Because of information asymmetry, because of resource asymmetry by majority sort of white Republican conservative areas against minority held areas. Number one. Number two, the district that my congressman specifically represents is what we call a VRA district. The Supreme Court, the conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals as well, found that Texas was intentionally suppressing racial minority voting power by cracking and packing minorities into majority white districts. Essentially, that they were taking minorities and shoving them all into one district where they could only elect one representative despite having more, arguably more people that is needed for more representatives, or they were cracking them where they would dilute the power of minorities in the similar geographic area across more spread out districts with larger white populations to create to dilute their voting power. That is how my congressman's district happened. A conservative court, a Republican controlled court, was let's say, this is how bad it was. They were like, you are being racist. You are voting the Voting Rights Act. That is why you need to redraw your maps. This map, currently in Texas, was originally drawn by Republicans. A conservative court then said in 2020 and 2021, you are intentionally cracking and packing minorities, and they said, no, we're not. We did this race blind. The court didn't buy the argument. They had to go back and redraw the map. This is still a Republican map in Texas. But now they're saying that this map is racist against white people and it was drawn to specifically dilute other minority power. So Republicans are lying somewhere, right? Because this is a Republican map that just a few years ago they said that was race blind. Now that they're saying it's a racist map. One, right? So which one is it? Number one. Number two, when we talk about mid-decade redistricting, this is how you disinfect the most amount of voters possible. We can talk about Gaza, Israel, Kamala Harris all we want, and how it turns off moderates and centrists in the party or progressives on the left wing, right? I think that's a really great debate to have. None of that matters if Democrats are redistricted to the point where you can't elect any Democrats, if that makes sense, right? We have we are in the minority by 3 seats. The average House swing is closer to 20 seats. There are only 12, I believe, 12 to 15 districts that were split districts between Republican and Democrats during this last election. I know this is complicated, but I promise I'm getting to the point. Medicaid was gutted by 3 votes in the House of Representatives. We cannot subpoena the Epstein files by 3 votes in the House of Representatives. We cannot stop unjust immigration laws by 3 votes in the House of Representatives. You see where I'm going. So when the Democrats were having all these debates on, I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris because of Gaza. I am not going to vote for Mamdani because in New York City as mayor because I believe he is too left wing, right? This ultimately all doesn't matter if you don't have Democrats in the first place that can enact any of those policies that you're talking about. This is why redistricting is so evil, right? Not only does it dilute minority voting power, but it is a prerequisite to any policy debate you want to have. You want to stop immigrants from being jailed, killed, or deported by this administration, you need a majority in the House and the Senate. The moment Texas goes through with redistricting and California doesn't respond, that debate doesn't matter anymore.
Mhm. I think that's a very hard truth, and I'm really glad that you were able to give us a short deep dive into this because I know that this is
Yeah, it's crazy
like,
complicated, I'm not gonna
yeah,
lie.
exactly. I mean, explaining American politics to my non-American friends is like, okay, you're gonna have to sit with me. I'll try to explain the Electoral College, how that works. But like, I also think it's very important um to also like think about how states like California, Illinois, New York, and other blue states are thinking about their redistricting and how they respond to it, but also, unfortunately, you also have the US Supreme Court, which is
Yes.
dominant. And that is also another blockade. And this is why we're seeing what we're seeing is like a snowball effect that's turning into an avalanche. Um, and what we're seeing now, I mean, like,
Judges sit forever.
yeah, judges can sit forever, and this is also a concern for a lot of folks who've been, paying attention to this. And I think it's really important to like really break this down. So I really appreciate this and this so like in this case, what can voters do? And how and what discussions should they have? And how do you think um or I should say, what do you think the messaging of the Democratic Party can look like for 2026? Because I feel like what voters should do and how this affects Democratic messaging, which is all over the place, in my opinion. Um, how is this going to translate into um, taking back the Senate, taking back the House? What does that landscape look like
Yeah,
going
let
forward?
me be very clear about something, right?
Mhm.
Democrats, and specifically minority Democrats, we do not have the privilege of agreeing on one platform for the entire nation. And here is what I mean. We have a platform, right? It is better access to healthcare. It is, you know, a improved immigration system. It is food on the table at a cheaper cost, keeping the lights on and, you know, making sure that you are able to afford housing, right? There are there are 200, I believe, 14, 13 Democrats that are currently sitting in the U.S. House of Representatives. There are 213 different ideas of how to achieve those goals. And here's why. The US Democratic Party is a big tent party, right? We are a patchwork of people. We are not a monolith. And that's great. That is where our strength and diversity comes from. That is why we consistently win larger portions of POC votes and minority votes, right? What does that mean? The Republican Party is a monolith. It is mostly white people in suburban, exurban, and rural areas that have a stronger and more congruent, not stronger, but a more homogeneous policy platform, right? You think of one idea from one, person there, it probably resonates with the entire people, and it's a top-down strategy, right? Whereas there's a lot of advocates on the ground in the Democratic Party trying to inform the leadership what they should do policy-wise, right? The Republican Party is top-down, where you have Donald Trump says something and what he says goes, right? And we can get into like why that has turned the United States into a soft autocracy or dictatorship in a bit. But let's focus on the Democrat Party, like you said. Here's what voters need to do, even if you're not a voter. That's problem number one. You need to fucking vote, right? Um, I do not agree with former President Obama on everything. I think one of his best lines ever is "Don't boo, vote." Right? If you do not vote, I do not want to fucking hear it from you. I don't want to hear how I'm not fighting hard enough, how, you know, someone in the US House of Representatives on the Democratic side isn't fighting hard enough, how you don't like Gavin Newsom, blah, blah. If you don't vote, I don't give a crap about your opinion, right? And this sounds harsh, but let me put it this way too. If you don't vote, do you think a Congress representative is going to then try to win your vote, right? If you don't vote, right, they're gonna be like, well, I'm not accountable to them. They didn't vote. They don't care enough on policy issues for me to win them over. If you're a moderate voter who swung for Donald Trump, they're gonna be like, we can win them back, right? That's why you need to vote, is so you can hold accountability, right? Because the more people vote, the more left wingers also vote, right? The more they can threaten an incumbent policy wise and like not winning re-election. If you don't vote and they somehow win without your vote or lose without your vote, the elected representative is going to take away the wrong message, right? They're just going to be like, well, I don't have to fight for their vote. So you need to vote. Number two, I think there's also this sense of everyone needs to go out and protest, et cetera, et cetera. There are many things that people can do. I think people are boxing themselves in too much. Protesting's great if you can do it. It is not for everyone for various reasons. Donate. And that doesn't just mean donate money. If you can donate money, you should, right, to candidates. But you can also donate your time, volunteer on a campaign, organizations, right, that like do this sort of policy work that you're passionate about. That's also how you plug in, right? Then finally, three, like run for office. Like this sounds stupid, but there are dozens of organizations that are dedicated to getting new candidates into office. Queer candidates, LGBTQIA plus Institute run by Evan Lowe, right? Funds hundreds of first-time queer candidates across the United States. They helped Sarah McBride get elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. They helped Julie Johnson in Texas get elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, right? So if you don't like something policy-wise and you think your policy ideas are good, you should consider running for office or working for someone who is going to consider running for office. That's how you
Mhm.
effectuate change.
I
I think, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna, probably step in here, but like from a devil's advocate side,
Hmm.
like if the US elected reps are not chasing non-voters or people who decide to sit out this election, then does that actually, I mean, how does that actually
Yeah,
because I mean, it feels counterintuitive from an elected representative standpoint that if they're not chasing these voters that they can't grab. And I think what's also, I think is really important to point out, especially I think the Obama election was a great example in 2008, where like um, voters felt, especially among marginalized communities, BIPOC communities, and they felt very disillusioned. I mean, what happened with Gaza, like when you have
yeah,
like Michigan was a great example of it. Like in Detroit, um, a lot of the with a lot of the growing Arab American population, there's more of them that actually had to sit out the election. And when you have to explain why I have to vote for someone who's also responsible for killing my relatives. And knowing that the Republicans are obviously worse, wherever you want to take that from. But like, it's there's a lot of distrust, and um, how do you actually restore that trust from a lot of the communities that have been heavily marginalized because they are the first to lose. They're the most vulnerable, but they are also um the most disillusioned with this country.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I think
Mhm,
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like I said, right? There are
mhm,
good, there are amazing Democratic elected
mhm,
officials, and there are those that are out of touch. I won't name names, obviously, right? But no party is perfect.
mhm,
But here's the issue, right? Is we don't have that privilege to vote for a perfect candidate or party. Like it sounds awful, right? But like a lot of political systems that are dual party, right? And I do mean dual party. Like, let's not kid ourselves with like Jill Stein, who's a Russian asset, right? And was named as Russian asset and is
hasn't
pro
done anything for the
hasn't
past.
done- AOC put it best.
Mhm,
If she was serious about winning, she wouldn't pop up like a jack in the box every 4 years to
mhm,
run and just steal votes, right? She would be building infrastructure to actually effectuate change. She's not.
mhm,
She has also said that Ukraine should give up territory, which, if you're going to also advocate for indigenous rights, right, in the US, you can't then just tell a different country give up territory for peace. That's not how this works. But what I'm trying to say is a lot of the voting that we do, unfortunately, is about harm reduction, right? This sounds awful, and I myself don't like it, but it is about moving the needle. If you can move it quickly, awesome. But most times you can't, right? That's just not how America works,
mhm,
unfortunately. It is about moving the needle as much as possible to make it just a little bit better continuously and effectuate that change. I have a good example about this. I think Kamala Harris's candidacy was hamstrung by Joe Biden for a lot of reasons, right? Like he essentially told her, "You can't contradict me in any way and go out there and defend me." Really weird and awful command from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. And I don't agree how she like what happened because essentially she lost the election when she said, "I wouldn't do anything differently than Joe Biden," right? And that turned off a lot of folks on the Gaza issue, et cetera, et cetera. Here's my question to third-party voters and non-voters. What has happened to Gaza since? And can you say that what is happening to Gaza now would have happened under Harris? Like truly, to this scale and magnitude. Would it, like had it's a weird situation too, right? Because like I am not Arab American, right? I'm Korean American. US occupation has destroyed Korea, right? Like we are still divided because of US and Soviet occupation. I am still voting Democrat because ultimately that's still a harm reductive policy, right? Against current circumstances. So, what other choice do we have? Because ultimately, if you vote third party, you're just virtue signaling, right? You give a mandate to Donald Trump. You tell folks like Donald Trump that you are willing to set out elections by pinning it on singular issues, right? Gaza, as awful as it is, by the way, is not the only issue that affects us as minorities, right? So by voting third party, you've doomed other minorities in the country, right, to live the life that they live. This is what I mean by harm reduction. Until we get to this paradise where politics are perfect, we have to move the needle any way that we can. What is happening right now in Gaza is a genocide. It's a famine that Netanyahu caused, that Donald Trump is tacitly allowing to happen. My opinion on this is that Harris would never have made set the words, "We should turn it into a resort with a Trump casino," right? We can debate Harris's foreign policy and what that would have looked like. If I don't think we know too well, frankly, right, on
mhm,
how far she would have differed from Biden or not.
mhm,
What I can say with absolute confidence is it would have been better for the entire country from a monetary perspective and an economic perspective.
mhm,
And knowing the signals that we were getting behind the scenes from the Harris campaign, it would have also been better from a Gaza perspective.
mhm,
So here's a good example. I was in a meeting with UNRWA, and they were like, "We would like you to unfreeze the funding for humanitarian aid to the U.S. refugee um, sort of organization on Gaza. And we were like, if Harris wins the election, we have gotten signals that she's going to do this. Guess what has not been unfrozen because Donald Trump won the election? Food aid to Gaza. Now it's in a famine and it's in a food genocide, right? So there are no easy answers to this question other than it is always about harm reductive policies.
Mhm.
And the moment that we decide to split votes like that in a system where third party votes are or not voting is frankly just not viable,
Mhm.
we lose more than we can possibly imagine. I think, by the
Mhm.
way, to use the example from my mom too, my mom was the first Democratic Korean election ever. Do you know who won that election as president? Was a former secondhand man to the dictator that they just threw out. Why? Because one progressive candidate and one center left candidate ran, and they split the Democratic ticket. And then the conservative military establishment vote was able to win that. That is unfortunately what essentially happened in many cases.
Mhm.
I'm not here to say Harris was perfect. I'm not here to say either that like her comparative silence on Gaza
Mhm.
was correct. I am going to stand by it when I say there's no way you can argue that Harris was somehow worse for Gaza than Donald Trump.
Mhm. Where does your congressperson stand on Gaza and also on the current immigration raids at this time?
Immigration rates?
Immigration rights and also with the deportation issues
Yeah,
along with Gaza.
listen, he is strongly pro
Mhm.
what's it called? Two-state solution, right? In the
Mhm.
Middle East. He always has been. He is he has been from the very beginning someone who supports food aid and aid, right? For civilians in Gaza.
Mhm.
And he has strongly also been against the antagonism that Donald Trump has essentially brought upon, right, in Israel and Gaza. And then when it comes to immigration, right, he's always been an advocate for fair immigration and reform. We've been sending, I don't know how many letters and investigations we've opened up into ICE abuses in our district, being like, you cannot detain people in this manner. You cannot
Mhm.
pull them over in this manner. You cannot deport them in this manner. You cannot, like we have sent God knows how many investigatory letters to fucking cosplay Christie in Ice, right? Like Ice Barbie, right? And being like, this is illegal. You cannot do this. Um, he's always been an advocate for like fair immigration and fair reform, right? He's also considered one of the experts at civil rights and voting and map and fair redistricting, right? Since the early 2000s as well. Um, it's just one of those weird situations that like we try to practice oversight as much as possible. In theory, congressional members and staff, by the way, are allowed to sort of go to an ICE facility and be like, "We're conducting congressional oversight," right? You have to let us conduct congressional oversight. They've been denying us. They charge Monica LaDriver with like trespassing, right? When legally a congressperson can't trespass when she's doing oversight. So, we're advocating all these positions, right? But the Republican Party in Congress has forfeited any sort of checks and balances on Donald Trump. This is why I say that we're in a soft dictatorship, right? Because in theory, a legislator system is not just there to like rubber stamp the executive's authority. I mean, same thing with the courts, right? It's there to provide a check so that when the executive agencies and authority are running rampant and breaking the law, that we can enforce the law or stop them from doing the worst things, right? That's not what's happening. Like we we've brought this up to agencies. We've tried to open up investigations. We've tried to conduct oversight. Um, Good example. Senator Alex Padilla literally was put in handcuffs and tackled at a press conference when he was calling out Kirsty Noem for breaking immigration law in the United States for ICE, right? That's the point we've gotten to. The Supreme Court didn't enforce their own ruling on Abrego Garcia for close to a month, and now he's being redeported to Uganda, right? Um, under Chris, this is what I mean, right? Like, the vast majority of Democrats, right, are pro pro immigrant, right, in some way, right? Like they have been advocating for immigration reform for the better part of a decade, and they've only controlled Congress for the past 12 years, right?
Hmm.
And it's normally only been one chamber, and it hasn't been the required two-thirds in the Senate for the most part to pass comprehensive immigration reform, or to ensure that like you were able to negotiate two-state solution to what's happening right now in the Middle East,
Hmm.
while ensuring the human rights of both of all involved, right? It's just one of those unfortunately weird situations where, like a good example, like early 2000s, we had President Bush, right? Even when we had a Democratic legislator, we didn't have a two-thirds majority, so he would veto things, right?
Hmm.
And he helped gut the government, and we never recovered from the Bush gutting, right? We then had President Obama, who, you know, had a lot of mixed bag policies, right? Moderate the Democratic stance on a lot of things, if we're gonna be totally honest. And then when we did have the two-thirds majority, it was for a short period of time
Hmm.
because of how the legislative sessions work. And, he passed the ACA, right? With this idea that we would continuously reform the ACA to make it better as years went along, but we never recaptured that two-thirds Senate majority since Obama's first term. And we've slowly lost, the House and the Senate since because of voter suppression, right? Like in Georgia, where they removed over 100,000 black voters from voter rolls to prevent Stacey Abrams from becoming governor all those years
Hmm.
ago.
Hmm.
So this is why I say like we're in a weird soft dictatorship situation, right? And
Hmm.
we're fighting back as hard as we can, but there's only so much that Congress can do legally, right?
Hmm.
There's only so much a Democratic representative is allowed to do under the US law legally. Um, and if the courts are unwilling to enforce the laws, then we get to the situation that we're in right now.
Hmm. I really appreciate you having to bring a lot of the nuances. I know that perhaps my listeners who are checking in on this episode are probably thinking, well, like I still don't agree with what's going on, and I think it's fair. I think it's very
Yeah.
fair to name that, to call that out for what it is. But I think that's why we need to have these discussions because nothing about policy is always going to be static. And I think like it can I mean, we have the ability to move goalposts, but it's about getting the numbers. And also I think that, you're speaking from having your congressional staffer hat on too. I also want to name that too, because I mean, you're juggling between Ed Do, the person, the activist, and then Ed Do, the congressional staffer who has to be pragmatic, who has to like listen to all the constituents that have differing solutions, differing point of views. And I think that's something
Right.
to really name that. Yeah.
What let me put it this way too.
Mhm.
The best way of putting it, right, as someone who is pragmatic and progressive is I never want the perfect to get in the way of the good, right? If we can do something, even if it's not perfect, but it's still good, then we should do it, right? If perfect's not going to happen, then fight for the next best thing, right? And continue to move that needle towards the perfect. The best way of putting it too is, there are moderates in Congress, there are centrists in Congress, and then there are progressives in Congress, right? Generally speaking, if you look at the Democratic Party, there's very little sort of disagreement, even from moderates and progressives, on what they have to vote no on, right? Like Medicaid cuts, right? Versus
Mhm.
where they start to like fall apart in terms of their
Mhm.
voting rules, right? Every Democrat voted against Medicaid cuts. Every Democrat voted for pro gun control reform. Every Democrat voted um
Abortion.
for right abortion, right? This is moderates and progressives, right? There's actually not that much difference other than style. I think the best thing I've heard while I've been in Congress is take this with a grain of salt. most moderates describe themselves, that's not my political position, right? Moderates are not saying that this is my political position. They're saying that that's their political style, right? How they negotiate on policy and how they do sort of like an A to B to C to D, right, is how moderates want to approach things. You can say yes or no, you can disagree on certain aspects of that thing, right? But that's how many of the moderate congressional people who I self-identify as moderates describe their style politically, right? They're not saying that they're, if I'm going to be totally honest, progressives, right, are sort of an A to F person, right? They'll skip the steps in between because they think they could get to F faster, right? And more effectively by skipping the steps in between. So there's a lot that people sort of try to oversimplify and being like, this person's a moderate, like blah blah. You look at most moderate Democrats, I would say they're pretty liberal populists, if I'm gonna be totally honest, right? They're pretty, right? Like a lot of weird centrist Democrats, right? Well, are like very pro-union labor, right? They're very like in all forms and aspects. They're pro-abortion. They're like very socially liberal. They like do XYZ. The reason why they don't identify as progressive is often because they're like, oh, because like the style in which I approach policy is I would describe as moderate. My point about this is there's a lot of nuance behind the scenes, right? When it comes to passing policy, as well as getting to a place where we do something good. So my philosophy about this being pragmatic is don't let the perfect get in with the good. I
Mhm.
think that's how people need to start approaching a lot of ballot boxes too. In 2020, in 2016, there is not a single Democratic candidate that aligned 100% with my views. I'm just going to put it out there, right? There were major flaws for me in each and every one of them. I still voted. I still was knocking on doors, calling, donating, right? To different candidates and then eventually the nominee because they ultimately still did good things.
Mhm. To make a gentle shift, and
Mhm.
one of the topics that I really want to talk about is, well, 2 years ago when I connected with you, the reason why I knew about you is because of Jonathan, but it's also what Jonathan posted was
Oh my God.
your um your wonderful encounter with U.S. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. Now, for my listeners who may not know who Senator Ted Cruz is, he is the Zodiac killer. Let's just call it for
Correct.
what it is. But he's also a person who has been a GOP right-winger from Texas who was elected during the Tea Party 2010 election. And some of the many, many offenses that he has caused Texas and practically the country and the world. One of them when there was a electrical shutdown during the winter freeze a few years ago, and in Texas, and Senator Ted Cruz just nonchalantly went to Cancun when this was
Yep.
happening.
Cancun
Um,
Cruise.
that is just one of many. How he got elected again, I don't even want to spend time on this because I know there's a whole lot of issues with Ted Cruz that just confounds me. But I want to know about what that encounter, what happened during that encounter, and give us a little bit of a story behind it because I'm very curious and I think it'll be a
Yeah.
fun,
So
entertaining.
I have known about Ted Cruz for many years, even prior to his elected rise to fame, because when I was in undergrad, I was part of a debate league nationally, right? I was a nationally competitive debater. Senator Cruz had been on this debate league, and he's infamous for having never won nationals, despite being a very talented debater, for many reasons. And everyone on this debate league hated him. They hated how he smelled, they hated his personality, they hated his guts. Um, so I knew way too much about him, and I knew so many stories about him as well. Like a really good example is one time he ran for president of the debate league and he lost unopposed. He lost when he was unopposed because there was a write-in candidacy for the chair he was sitting in, and the chair won. Eventually, they ended up electing a protest candidate who ended up becoming president of the league. But that is how disliked Ted Cruz is. He has always been disliked. Fast forward. Ted Cruz is Ted Cruz, gets elected, does all the awful shit that he does. So during the first GOP attempt at repealing Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, um, I was young and out of college. I was in Washington, D.C. at my first college job, and a bunch of friends and I went to the congressional baseball game. For those of you who don't know, it's when different representatives and senators from each who are elected, right, form teams, Republican versus Democrat, and they play a baseball game for charity. All the proceeds go to charity. So I obviously buy with my friends tickets to the Democratic section, and I am probably 8 drinks in, and not beer, but like those tall body-sized hurricanes, right? That are like this big, that are flutes. And there is a very infamous picture of me in which I am pretending to be the Statue of Liberty with two flutes because I drank 6 of them. I don't remember that picture. Here's what I do remember is we were sat at the edge of the Democratic section. Ted Cruz was right on the other side on the Republican section. I see his entourage and him file into their seats. And I stand up on my seat, and it is very obvious who I'm with. I have a blue shirt that says Democrats, Union Made. And I go, Senator Cruz, and Senator Cruz. And if you know me, my voice, as like nasally as it cuts, right? Like you can hear it. It booms. So Ted Cruz stops, looks at me, and he smiles and he waves. And I'm like in front of everyone, admit that you are going to cut funding to the ACA. Because at this point he was dancing around it and he was just sort of like, we're not cutting funding to the ACA, we're just getting rid of mandates. He then goes, like, so he admits it, right? And then that's when I start heckling him. I call him the Zodiac Killer. I ask him about why he didn't wear deodorant because his roommate from Princeton had publicly stated that he had smelled. We also had anecdotes from the stories about Debate League where he smelled like toe jam and fungus
Mm.
for whatever reason. He just, not great hygiene. And I then start hurling insults at Ted Cruz. Right? I was 22 at the time. Um, and I don't stop. This goes on for 2, 3 innings of the baseball game. Eventually, Ted Cruz decides to leave the baseball game early because that year it was very obvious at this point in the game that the Democrats were going to win. So he exits. I was still pretty inebriated. I sprint. And I am about 6 feet away from Ted Cruz. And I just start yelling, Zodiac Killer, Zodiac Killer. Um, And I see what seems to be 2 security guards, right? And not like baseball stadium security guards. I'm talking like US federal security guards assigned to like senator details start walking towards me. I then dash it back into the Democratic section. I like hide among the crowd, a blue. And that is how Ted Cruz found out who I was. My boss the next day was just sort of like, I heard from different staff members that you had heckled Ted Cruz and called him the Zodiac Killer. And I was about to apologize. And she goes, good job. So proud of you. And she goes, why don't you take the rest of the day off?
My gosh. Thank you for doing the Lord's work. I think that's pretty amazing.
I know I really
And
peaked back in 2017.
yeah, I mean, you still have an opportunity now. I mean, you work in the halls of Congress and
Oh my God, I think I would get fired if I did that in the same way. Or
true.
I would get denaturalized and deported from this with this administration.
Well, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I think it really goes into like, I mean, I also want to keep this also light at the same time
Hmm.
because I think it's also important to recognize that we need a level of optimism and joy to be creative in how we work against the systems that be. And one of the things that has been a concern of mine, and I have actually part of the reason why I'm back in the podcasting is because um in the last presidential election, um there have been a lot of harmful narratives, disinformation that has come from podcasters, specifically the Joe Rogans of the world, that are
Yeah.
targeting young Gen Z male voters. And we saw what that did. And we have also seen the the precipitous decline of traditional media and 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 the um public's um the shifting landscape from traditional media outlets to independent media creators from like YouTube, TikTok, podcast. I'm very curious to know, like, from a Democrat, from that responsibility, how do you intercept the harmful narratives that are going on and the disinformation that's happening, and how do you counter that to talk to young voters or people that the Republicans have been trying to entertain?
I'm gonna be totally honest. Um, Democrats fell behind. They did not get on that train, and they didn't take Donald Trump as a serious threat because he was so ridiculous and outside of what they were used to in terms of the norm of political engagement, right? That they thought that no American would ever vote for him. But that's not what happened, right? He tapped into the fears that a lot of, I think, uninformed, frankly racist, frankly sexist folks in America had, and he capitalized on that. And part of the way he did that, like you said, is he captured new media. He saw the trends with younger folks, right? And what's really insane to me is, part of the reason why the Obama coalition performed the way it did and won, right, was because it had started to use things like phone apps, like social media.
Mhm.
But then as soon as that ended, Democrats sort of defaulted back to traditional media where they had been losing ground, but just not understanding why. So there has been a really the part of the reason why I came back to Capitol Hill, right? Part of the reason why they hired me is because I'm very aggressive with my communication style, right? I'm also someone who pushes people to go on podcasts, to go on Instagram Reels, or to use Twitter or to use Blue Sky, right? Not necessarily for meme purposes, right? But to communicate and to come off as more authentic as well. No one is, like people like you and me in your audience, they might enjoy when I talk about like the nuances of redistricting, right? Most people will fall asleep. So part of my way of doing this is part of the reason why I do this is to sort of make people not only seem more genuine, because I think there's also this idea that Democrats are elitist for various reasons. So they need to come off as more genuine and authentic, but they also need to engage with content creators, right? And I think you're starting to see that, right? You have people like, Kamala Harris went on Call Me Daddy, right? That's insane. If you were to tell me a Democratic like elected official were to go on what is normally a sex podcast like 5 years ago, I would have been like, you're fucking crazy. That's not the case anymore. You have people starting to go on sports podcasts, like I've encouraged my congressperson to go on a barbecue podcast to talk about how much he likes to barbecue. Because inevitably things like food security are going to come up anyway, right? But it also shows that he's a real person, right? Beyond just like him as a member of Congress.
Mhm.
We've also started a podcast, right? Like there is a new Democrat coalition podcast called The Fly-In, right? And it's about delivering everything you need to know about policy and news in a format that's 20 minutes or less, but also playing games to do it as well. They're more active on Instagram. Frankly, my opinion about this is too is that they need to start going on like your podcast, right? Like I think we talk about the Rogans of the world, right? That's great. And we should be going on the Rogans of the world. James Tallarico from Texas recently went on Rogan, and Rogan was like, "Wow, you're fantastic," right? We should have been doing that 5, 6 years ago. People wrote off Rogan. We should still do that. But they also need to go on, I think, more niche podcasts like yours, speaking to, you know, Southeast Asians, queer people of color, right? Because those are where you're going to win on the margins, right? And those are also podcasts that are going to speak to the nuances of policy, right? So the strategy that I have brought is we are going to go on podcasts that talk about barbecue, that talk about football, and we're going to go, frankly, on center right podcasts as well, right? We're going to create Instagram reels. We're going to do all of that. We're also going to go on smaller content creators or more niche content creators to win on the margins as well.
Mhm.
And that has been a long time coming. And I'm not gonna lie, there's a massive gap still. The top, I believe, eight largest podcasts and new content creators currently in the US media market are right wing. The largest one that comes close is ACYN, and that's still, I think, eight times smaller than Joe Rogan on average daily viewership. We have cracks though there. Midas Bros, for example, right? Back in February, their viewership exceeded the top five right-wing content creators in podcasts for
Mhm.
the first time in new media recorded history, right? So we are making progress, but we need to continue with that momentum and we need to speed it up. And that's part of the work that my congressman has been doing as well. He, back in 2012, when he got elected, said, we need to do our own podcast, we need to do all these things. People didn't listen to him. Now suddenly they're listening to him, and they've listened to him to the point where he's been elected vice chair of communications for the new Democratic coalition because they were like, oh, he saw the writing on the wall.
Don't forget Substack. That's another
Yeah,
one too.
and
Keep an eye
Substack
on.
with Randy Kim, Buy Me
Yeah,
Chronicles, everyone.
and Substack, I don't want to, do this promotion because I should get paid for Substack if I'm going to do this. But I think it's also important to note that, yeah, there's also unfortunate right wingers doing Substack too. So, like, for me and for a lot of progressive folks, I know there's some people that are trying to leave that platform, but I'm also like, I don't want it to be another Twitter grave. Like, I want to, like, counter or be a part of what counters what's happening too. And
Yeah,
also, like, continue to create media. That does not have to be confined to the big corporate platforms. So I think that the more we create, the more collaborations we have, the better we're
yeah.
off. And I think to as we start to like wrap up soon, but like how do you take care of yourself? How do you and your colleagues take care of yourself during this time? I mean, we're only like 9 months into this administration and we got like at least a good 3+ years. And
Man, I don't.
yeah, yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, it's been tough. Like in 9 months, I have not taken a day off of work. Um, if you know me and you know my colleagues, there are literally weeks that we don't go home. Like we have blow up mattresses in Democratic offices to monitor situations so that we can respond to them and like open up challenges immediately or like inform the public immediately. Like during like the Medicaid gutting, literally did not go home for a week. I went home twice to walk my friend's dog because they were on their honeymoon. And I went home once at 3 a.m. to feed my cat. And then I was called because the vote for gutting Medicaid was being called at 3 a.m. that morning. I kid you not, right? This is the reality that we're living in. Um, so I'm not gonna lie, there's not actually a lot of self-care that I'm able to do in my job,
Mhm.
right? And that's not, it is a privilege to serve and to fight the way that I'm doing. And I love my office. And I am doing this job because I truly mean it when I say I want the next generation and this generation to have it better. But it's tough. Um, I don't have, I need therapy and psychiatrist, right? Since I moved from Chicago, but um, I don't have time for weekly appointments right now. I don't, right? Like there, even there are nights that I get off of work and then an emergency pops up and I'm back in work, and that's most nights or most, right? Like I came home today and I was getting ready for your podcast and I had to respond to an illegal ICE detention, potentially illegal ICE detention in our district and figure that out, right? Um, so there's not a lot of self-care, but there is joy. And that's a little different from self-care, right? And let me explain. This is advice for everyone, right? Who's not me.
Mhm.
The best resistance you can offer is joy, right? Enjoying the things that make you you, whether that's being super fucking gay or super fucking Asian or super fucking like whatever, your identity is and celebrating that. If that means that you are in your Aodai and you're at an event, or if you're, you know, Korean and you're cooking the smelliest like hajangguk that you can, that is an act of resistance, right? That is what the Republican Party is trying to stamp out, is celebrations of cultural expression and personal expression, right? So that is an act of joy and resistance. So I have not been able to self-care that much. My boss, by the way, my chief of staff at my yearly review back in August said, "You've done a great job. Here's my one critical piece of feedback for you. I need you to take a vacation. I need you to take a break. I need you to unplug. You are going to burn out. You have not taken a break. You are, on 24/7." And he was just like, I understand it feels impossible, but the moment you feel like you can take a break, I need you to take like a vacation. So I'm going to do that at some point. I just don't know when yet. But in the meantime, I found joy in the acts of resistance that connect me and ground me to who I am. So I love Taekwondo. I've done it since I've been 3. It's inherently a Korean martial art, right? And it has roots in several different Korean folk martial arts, right? That connects me to my culture. That connects me to my ancestor. That's something inherently not white and American, right? That is a joy and an act of resistance. I bake a lot of Korean fusion desserts. That is an act of joy and resistance. I went to World Pride and I went to a bunch of different parties, talked to a lot of cute boys who don't really hit me up anymore, but that's a different story. But that was an act of resistance and joy.
Mhm.
So in the moments where I cannot do active self-care, which has been the past 9 months, it's the acts of resistance and joy in Taekwondo and celebrating queerness that give me a lot of joy. And frankly, like going on this podcast, right? Like
Mhm.
there's not a lot of spaces where we can talk about things like this, right? There's between two queer Asians and like sort of like experiencing the nuance of what that means in our context and decolonization and what that means in politics and policy moving forward and having those discussions, right? This is an act of joy. This is an act of resistance. That is how I'm experiencing whatever self-care I can.
Mhm.
Um, and you bring up a good point. We are only 15% of the way through this presidency, even though it's felt like years. And these acts of joy, these moments of resistance are what's going to get us through. Last note on this, right, is I remember my congressperson had their birthday and they invited obviously their staff, right? His staff, as well as other members of Congress, organizations, blah, blah. And I remember he gave a toast at his birthday. And I, we started to cry because it hit us like a shit ton of bricks. We were only 3 months into the presidency at this point. And he goes, for this one night, I want everyone in this room who dedicates their life to public service, to defeating this great evil that we're facing right now, to building a better democracy and republic for everyone, for people that we love and care about, for future generations. He goes, we have a long, long, long road ahead of us. There are going to be challenges. Some of us might not even be here at the end of this. That's how dire the situation goes. But for tonight, I want to thank you for taking time to celebrate me. But this birthday is a day that I just want us to break bread and enjoy each other's presence because we are going to have time to fight for the next 4 years. But for the next like 4 or 5 hours, let's break bread, eat good food, and remind each other of how much we love each other and being each other's companies because there's not going to be a lot of moments like this.
Mhm.
So my
Great.
advice to just people, and we started crying because we
Mhm.
realized how true that was. So my advice to anyone who's listening to the podcast, I don't care if you take away anything. I don't care if you're like, this person is a fucking shill for Democrats, even though I don't think I am, right? The one thing I want you to take away is those moments of joy, those moments of peace and rest that you're able to find amidst this chaos, as privileged as it sounds, are your best acts of self-care and resistance that you can offer in this moment. We
Mhm.
will have time to fight every day. Any excuse you have. to celebrate your joys, take them.
Mm. And I want to say thank you, Ed, for for being so insightful, for taking the time out of a very wild schedule that you've been running on since the beginning of this administration. And also, where can people follow you and where can people, check you out?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow me on my Instagram, right? I'll have to approve you, right? But it's A Edo, EYEY, EDO on Instagram. You can follow me on LinkedIn, just Edward Doe. And shoot me a message, shoot me a request. I'm always here to answer questions. You can watch me document my life on Capitol Hill, right, behind the scenes, my thoughts, on occasion, right, where I believe I can and not break ethics rules. My life complaining about how much pain Taekwondo causes me, even though I do it daily. Um, and my opinions on food, which are quite harsh, as Randy knows. And finally, like you can also follow me for thirst traps, right? Because I'll occasionally post them for, because I have brand sponsorships that do require me to post thirst traps, right? It's for to maintain those brand sponsorships. But I recently, really funny anecdote, I posted a thirst trap and um, I put information about Texas's like mid-decade redistricting on that thirst trap just so I could be like, now that I have your attention. And someone messaged me and goes, "Hey, I just want buy from that thirst trap. Goes, hey, I just want to let you know I donated from the first time to this person's political campaign and sent in XYZ information to volunteer on this other person's political campaign because of your information that you've been posting about Capitol Hill and what you're doing to fight back, and it's been really inspiring." And he goes, "I originally followed you for your thirst traps, um, but I'm going to keep following you for informative political content." So that is the array that you'll get on my Instagram.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Ed. And I hope that, people follow your journey. And, I know that I typically these days I've said like, gosh, I don't really want to do anything over an hour for a podcast ever again. Well, two episodes in, I'm already like, that rule has already been broken. But you know what? I think this is a very urgent time that we're living in. And I think that we have a responsibility to really not only know what the current landscape is, but also how did we get here, and also what are the barriers that are happening that are preventing us from having a strong resistance. And I think this is a really important starting point. So I hope that, people can take away and have ideas and maybe start collaborations that will start to, you know, take down this evil empire that we're living in. So I want to say thank you so much for your time, Ed, and much, much love to you and all the care and protection on Capitol Hill to you and your colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Randy. First of all, I've always liked your podcast, right? But like podcasts like yours are extremely important, right? For so many reasons. So you're also doing God's work, right? Like I said, resistance looks different, labor looks different, right? How you can contribute looks different. I think this is a really important step here. And I really encourage people, right? Don't let the perfect get in the way of the good as we form these resistance movements.
Thank you so much.